This video is sponsored by Only Crits. A few months ago, I made a video about the cover for the new Player's Handbook and how it might actually be my favorite Player's Handbook cover. And we talked about the other covers from the past and what I think makes for a great Player's Handbook cover. And since then, I've also made videos about the covers for the new Dungeon Master's Guide and the Monster Manual. But I got a comment back when that first Player's Handbook video came out, and I've wanted to make a video that could address that comment. Bruce Bernizy commented, "Whew, no critique so far of my cover. I do have a question though. Does my Spelljammer cover fall into or avoid the D&D cover trap by having no party members at all? P.S. Love this channel, keep up the great work." So, first of all, apparently Bruce, an artist who has done a lot of work for Wizards of the Coast, watches my channel, or at least has seen a few of my videos, and that's pretty cool. I even unknowingly used one of his art pieces in my Greyhawk video. I think this piece of art is really fantastic. And his Spelljammer cover is also really cool. I like it a lot. And that brings me to the question he asked in his comment. Do I think his Spelljammer cover falls into the D&D book cover art trap? For those who don't remember, that's something I talked about in my Player's Handbook video. It's the tendency for great D&D artists to all seemingly default to the same shorthand when designing a Player's Handbook cover. Two adventurers, one of them a fighter, and the other usually a magic user. And it seems like Bruce was wondering if I would be in favor of his decision to not show any adventurers on the Spelljammer cover. And I suppose if I didn't approve of that decision, it sounds like he'd be wondering if I would consider that choice lazy in the way that I sort of derided the Player's Handbook covers that keep defaulting to the same book cover art trap. However, this actually gives me an excuse to talk about something that I've wanted to discuss for a long time. There was a lot of stuff I had to cut out of the Player's Handbook video because it just got so long, and I had to keep my focus on the Player's Handbook covers, because the whole point of that video was that I think a Player's Handbook cover has to do a lot of heavy lifting. There's a lot that one of these covers needs to establish about the game and the way that it's played and the options that are available to the players. And the reason I didn't talk about campaign covers in that video is because I think a great campaign setting cover has a completely different set of criteria. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to take a look at all of the official 5th edition campaigns from Wizards of the Coast, and we're going to see if we can't learn some lessons about what makes for a great campaign setting cover. And just as a reminder, if I offer any criticism towards any of these covers, that is not meant to be an indictment of the artist. I think all of these art pieces are excellent. What I want to do is figure out how well they communicate what the campaign setting is all about. And half the time that just comes down to my own personal sensibilities and what I think is important about a given setting. And even if I think something is objective, that's really more a criticism of the decisions made by the production team that set up the art brief and not the artists themselves. Also, before we get into the video, I just want to remind you that if you are a patron or a YouTube member, you can comment on one of my recent posts and submit questions that you'd like to see me cover in my January Q&A video. I wasn't able to do that video in December, so we're doing that Q&A at the end of January instead. So if you have a question you'd like to see me tackle, and it's not a big enough question that it demands an entire video about it, then consider checking out the Patreon and comment on that post with your question. The link is in the description below. Now that that's covered, let's talk about some covers. The first book we're going to talk about today is the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide. This is the campaign setting for the Forgotten Realms, and this book has definitely garnered a reputation as a fairly lackluster setting book. And at first glance, it seems like the cover is also just a little bit lacking. Don't get me wrong, like I said, this is a great piece of art, and I do definitely give it some points for having more than 2 characters on the cover. It dodges the art trap. But it is essentially just an image of 5 adventurers facing off against some unseen enemies in a fairly generic landscape. There's something about this cover that screams that it has to take place in the Forgotten Realms and could not represent any other setting. However, I have 2 points that I want to make in defense of this cover. The first is that the Forgotten Realms was the default setting for 5th edition. I clearly have my own feelings about whether or not that was a good decision, but that doesn't change the fact that this was where the designers expected most players to run their games, at least if they were playing through the published adventures. So I could see the argument that this cover for their setting guide didn't need to display any distinctive iconography or iconic characters because it was just trying to be the default, borderline generic campaign setting for players who were still new to the game. I think we'll see from the rest of the books that we're going to talk about today that they probably realized this was not the right decision and that their future setting covers should offer a more distinctive take on what makes the setting unique and maybe offer some iconic characters from the setting, the way that, honestly, so many of their books would go on to do. However, my second point is that I don't really want to dock points from this cover for not having any iconic characters on it, because I think these were supposed to become iconic characters. I've tried to find a source for this, and I've been completely unable to track it down, so you have to forgive me that my source is essentially just, I remember this was a thing. But the adventurer who is front and center on this cover is named Hitch. He's a rogue who has a bit of history with the Zentarim, and he would later go on to be played by Utkarsh Ambudkar in the actual play show Force Grey Giant Hunters. Gotta find a new place to put my water bottle so it doesn't mess up continuity. That show was produced by Nerdist, but was done so in heavy collaboration with Wizards of the Coast, in preparation for the release of Storm King's Thunder. It was also run by Matt Mercer, and the other players included Shelby Farrow, Ashley Johnson, Jonah Ray, Brian Posehn, and Chris Hardwick, so this was a big deal. Now, when this actual play show was getting ready to air, I remember hearing an interview with the designer from Wizards of the Coast, which, again, I wish I could track down, but this designer talked about who Hitch was and the ideas that they had for his character. This wasn't an interview with Ambukar, this was someone from the D&D team, which seemed to indicate that Hitch, as well as maybe a few of the other characters, like I believe Calliope, were characters that had been functionally assigned to the actual play by the D&D team, and these players had been recruited to play these characters specifically. I don't think that was true of all the characters. Chris Hardwick was playing a character named Will Wheaton. I doubt anybody at Wizards of the Coast came up with that character, but it seemed to be true of at least a couple of them. My guess is that Wizards of the Coast wanted their own version of Vox Machina that they had all the rights to themselves. So they created these characters and then cast a show so they could put these characters into the spotlight. And after Force Grey, Hitch has appeared as a playable character in the official phone game Idle Champions of the Forgotten Realms. But not much more has happened with the character since then. And I think the reason for that is because, well, you noticed I said one of the other players in Force Grey Giant Hunters was Chris Hardwick. I was going to make a whole video about just this topic and how Chris Hardwick essentially killed the efforts of Force Grey to become its own franchise, but then I realized I don't want to. So I'll just quickly summarize it as part of this video. Hardwick played a very silly character, a wizard who constantly casts Fireball and throws the party into difficult situations, but then he was killed by a trap in the 5th episode of a 7-episode series, so he wasn't a part of the last 2 episodes, but he really only missed about the last hour and a half of the adventure. Then, 2 years later, Chris Hardwick's ex wrote about some abusive behavior she'd experienced in a romantic relationship, but she didn't name Hardwick specifically. However, other people came forward and confirmed that she'd been referring to Chris Hardwick, or at least they felt very strongly that that's who she meant, so he essentially got Me Too'd, and he briefly lost a bunch of gigs while Nerdist investigated the claims. But his ex was never looking for revenge, that's why she didn't name him, and so that's also why she didn't participate in the investigation. And so, without her cooperation, the investigation obviously couldn't go anywhere, and Hardwick got most, if not all, of his old jobs back. However, during that initial investigation period, all the episodes of Force Grey were scrubbed from Nerdist's YouTube channel. And unlike most of the rest of Chris Hardwick's content, Force Grey never went back up. The live shows at the beginning of the end of the season stayed up because he wasn't there for either of those. And the second season, Lost City of Omu, was completely unaffected. But even the episodes of Giant Hunters from after Hardwick's character died remained offline, presumably because they were the final 2 entries in a story that would have been pretty incomplete if you were just to watch them on their own. Those episodes have been re-uploaded by other YouTubers, but never Nerdist or Wizards of the Coast. So, bringing it back to the topic of this video, the adventure where we met Hitch and learned about his backstory had now functionally become lost media. So if indeed Wizards of the Coast wanted their own version of Vox Machina, and Hitch was one of the first characters they created towards that endeavor, events outside of their control kept that from ever being a possibility. Like I said, Hitch is in the Idle Champions game, but that's about it, as far as I can tell. And so I think if Wizards of the Coast was making this book today, they would have done the same thing they did with the covers of the new core rulebooks. They would have put iconic characters that people knew from the Forgotten Realms on the cover, rather than trying to create their own. Maybe characters like Elminster or Boo, or look, let's be honest, if they were doing it today, probably characters from Baldur's Gate 3. I know they're working on another Forgotten Realms campaign book right now, and so if they're smart, they'll probably put a bunch of Baldur's Gate 3 characters on the cover. Just front and center, put Asterion and... I haven't played the game. Shadowcat? No, that's an X-Man. Anyway, let's move on to all the other setting covers, which all have a lot less loaded drama behind them. Well, most of them. We'll get to you. Who am I kidding? That drama was nowhere near as big a deal as the Hardwick scandal. We opened with the cover with the spiciest backstory. Now, the first big campaign setting book for 5th edition was Ravnica. Ravnica is a setting from Magic the Gathering, which is another game that I've never played. And later this year, I do plan to review this Ravnica book from the perspective of someone who has no pre-existing knowledge of that world. I did read this book back around the time it came out. Actually, I specifically remember reading it a lot in the days leading up to my wedding. I do not remember how I had the free time to do that, but I remember making a bunch of characters on my phone in D&D Beyond in Monterey while standing in the parking lot of a strip mall waiting for Michael's to open. I don't know how I did that. But the point is, I do know a little bit about this setting based on my hazy memories from 2021. And so now I want to talk about how this cover conveys what this setting is all about. We have a character front and center on the cover, and first of all, it's not a white guy, it's a woman of color, which is fantastic. You know that I am all in favor of more diverse art to make sure new players know that they can see themselves playing this game and being a part of these worlds. So as far as I'm concerned, putting this character center on the cover is already a great start. But let's also look at what she's doing. She seems to be catching a lightning bolt with one hand, and then that lightning is traveling through some technology that she's wearing and into a device that she's holding in her other hand. She's essentially using science to capture the elements. And so already that should tell you a lot about the campaign setting in this book. You know that this is a world where science is far more advanced than in our own world, and the people of this world are literally taking control over the elements and natural phenomena that we take for granted. Now, I think you could also argue that she's not capturing random lightning, she's probably casting a spell, but that's not really confirmed. In fact, there's no reason to assume this world is magical at all. Or at least there would be no reason to assume that, if not for maybe the most important detail the artist included, the fact that there's a dragon perched just behind the adventurer. So that's a very clear message that this is a fantasy world. However, this dragon isn't just perched on a rock. The dragon is standing on some sort of metal disc, like part of a building. And far in the distance, we can see spires of a city which seems to be inspired by medieval architecture, but is also still a little bit of a futuristic city. And so, because this dragon is standing on the edge of a building, we realize that mythological beasts are just part of this world. But because we can also see the city far in the distance, we get the sense that we're not outside the city off in the wilderness. We're still in the city, or we're in another very close city. Either way, there's a lot of urban sprawl in this world, and that's a reference to the fact that the entire world of Ravnica is one big city. And in fact, if you see the whole image, which wraps around the back of the book, it's a lot clearer that we're in the same vast city. And there are also some angels flying around in the sky next to the very cathedral-looking spires of this advanced city. So yeah, I think this cover does an excellent job of conveying what makes Ravnica interesting. And it was able to do so with only one adventurer, which is really impressive. That's actually very hard to do. Now, Eberron does have 2 adventurers on the cover, which means it falls into the D&D book cover art trap, and that means it's bad. No, I'm joking. That was absolutely never my point. I was speaking to the fact that it's become the accepted shorthand across the tabletop industry that we're almost always going to see 2 adventurers on the cover of a book, often posing for the camera. However, I don't think that means that anyone who does that is doing it wrong. First of all, a lot of these covers are great, but second of all, the goal is to use these 2 characters to communicate as much as you can about the kinds of characters a player can create if they buy the book, which means you want these characters to really demonstrate what makes this book cool. And Eberron absolutely accomplishes that task. One of the adventurers is a halfling who is very deliberately coated with native/aboriginal clothing and weapons. Obviously, this is a little bit reductive. I'm not an expert in any of these cultures, so please be understanding if this is a generalization or is not accurate. My goal isn't to be offensive in any way. But as a person who doesn't know anything about Eberron or really anything about any native cultures, it seems like the boomerang is a reference to the Australian Aboriginals, the hair is closer to what we might think of in depictions of Native Americans, the poncho seems reminiscent to me at least of Central America, and the sword, sandals, and maybe the loincloth are all a little bit reminiscent of Arabian culture. And if any of that is inaccurate, I do apologize, but I think it still makes my point clear. This character is coded as someone culturally similar to the native people from many of our own world's cultures, but specifically pre-colonial, non-white cultures. And that tells us that we are leaving behind the generic medieval fantasy tropes in favor of something a little bit more worldly. This is confirmed by the fact that the characters are in a box canyon, which is not really the type of environment we tend to associate with medieval fantasy. This could be a more arid environment, like what you see in the Middle East or the American Southwest, which is where a lot of the world's most famous box canyons can be found. But the other adventurer shows us the vast difference in styles of characters that exist in Eberron, because the other adventurer is just a robot. I know people in the comments are always quick to correct me that Warforged are more than just robots, but remember, book covers are meant to convey information to players who do not know anything about what's inside. And so this cover tells us that you can play a robot. But also, the robot is wearing clothes, and that tells you a lot about the culture of the robot. And if you know a little bit about D&D, you'll also notice that this robot isn't just wearing clothes, it's wearing robes, and it's not carrying any weapons. So this robot is a spellcaster? I don't know that for certain, but that is the message that I get when I look at this cover. I mean, I suppose it could be a monk instead, but considering we're working with shorthand, I'd imagine a monk would be either in a more explicitly martial arts-inspired stance, or would have a staff or some nunchucks or something like that. However, there's one more pretty important detail on this cover. When you look at the full image, what's that on the back of the book? Oh, it's a dinosaur. There's a velociraptor on the back of the book. Actually, velociraptors are small, this is probably a Deinonychus, but the point still stands. Eberron is very clearly a world that does not have a lot of the same limitations as our classic medieval fantasy worlds do, because there's dinosaurs and robots and different biomes and a more worldly culture. Very cool book cover. I should definitely read this book at some point. I hear good things. Next, let's discuss Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft. I've talked about this book before, but I didn't review the cover in that video. First of all, unlike any of the other books we're going to talk about today, this book is actually named after a specific NPC, so of course he shows up on the cover along with his apprentice Esmeralda. But I think this is a pretty different kind of cover from most of the others. Van Richten has his back to us, so we can't really look at him and get a sense of what kind of character we could create in this setting. All we really get from him is that he carries a cane and a lantern and has a tome hanging off of his belt. So I kind of think he's just here mostly to help capture the vibe of the setting. Esmeralda does a better job of demonstrating what kind of character you can make in the sense that she's a monster hunter, but let's be honest, the options in this book don't really match up with the design of either of these two characters because these are existing characters that predate any of the game material presented in the book. So this actually seems to represent Wizards of the Coast focusing more on their IP rather than simply putting unnamed characters on the cover who represent the material available to players inside the book itself. And ordinarily that's not something that I would love. I would want the characters to actually represent the kind of characters you can create with this book. But I think the player options are such a minor part of this book that I kind of don't really mind it here. I actually think it's fine to include these NPCs, because these NPCs can specifically travel between the different domains of Dread. They are actually characters from this book. This book is actually presenting a world where your players can fight evil monsters. So really, that's what the characters on the cover are conveying. It's not about whether or not you can play a College of Spirits bard or take the Haunted One background or whatever. It's about selling you on the premise of fighting gothic horror monsters. If anything, the characters on the cover help to give you a sense of what sort of characters you should create to better match the tone of these games, and that is in line with the guidance presented in the book. But of course, the star of the show on this cover is Count Strahd von Zarovich himself. And when you look at the background, you can see his castle, Ravenloft, in all its glory. But there's also a lot of excellent set dressing to help set the scene. Specifically, there's a full moon and a flock of ravens. I guess, actually, the term would be an unkindness of ravens. But they also look like they're billowing out from the Count's cloak, so maybe he just startled all these birds? Except they also have red eyes that match his cloak, so it feels more like he's controlling them, or maybe he even summoned them. And yeah, I think this does a really excellent job of conveying the tone of the book itself. It takes a very different approach than most of the others that we've seen so far, or that we'll talk about throughout the rest of this video, but I think that sort of speaks to what makes a campaign-setting book, at least a campaign-setting book cover, so exciting. There really aren't any rules. I think we default to showing adventurers in action because that's a good way to sell new players on the gameplay loop. But of course, setting books aren't always necessarily meant for new players. Unlike a player's handbook cover, we don't expect you to learn to play by reading these books. So the artists have a little bit more freedom because of that. So really, the mission statement of a campaign-setting book cover artist is just to capture the vibes of the setting. And this cover absolutely does that. Next, we have Mythic Odysseys of Theros, and this one is extremely straightforward. We see a city that is heavily inspired by ancient Greece, but all the structures are painted. So this is definitely a modern culture, not an ancient ruin. That's a small detail, but it's really important, because it helps make sure that you know that this is actually set in an analog for ancient Greece, and not in a setting where your ancient Greek equivalent has already risen and fallen. Then we have an adventurer, and he's basically dressed in the same style we associate with ancient Greek or Spartan heroes, and he's fighting a Hydra. So once again, this helps really drive home the idea that this is inspired by ancient Greek myths. The Hydra is also cleaving through a statue, and again, the statue is painted, so that helps signify that we are not looking at ancient ruins, but instead at a thriving, modern culture. And the statue depicts a goddess, although I don't know if you would know that just by looking at it. Except this woman's hair seems to be painted to look like a blue void with stars in it, and we can see the same imagery on her bow as well. And that might seem like a small detail, but the Hydra itself also seems to have stars wherever the shadows hit it. And this actually tells us a lot. First of all, it tells us that we are definitely getting a very cool, very different stat block for a Hydra. And that feels like a pretty big deal because I have some issues with the Hydra stat block in the 2014 Monster Manual. The monster is full of stars, which is sort of conveys the idea that it's from another world. It's not an alien necessarily, but it's certainly not a natural creature the way we often think of a lot of these monsters as. And then we're reminded of the fact that this woman also has stars in her hair and in her bow, so these creatures are linked in some way. Presumably this woman and this monster come from the same place or the same source. It's a very subtle touch, but it really does convey a lot. And if we look at the back of the book, we can also see that the structures of the civilization stretch up into the trees. And that's just a really nice way to convey the fact that this is very much not just ancient Greece, but it is a culture that is more advanced and more magical in some pretty significant ways. Now, so far, all the covers we've talked about have all basically had adventurers being awesome, either posing dramatically or fighting monsters. But now we get a very radical departure from that style of cover with the art for Strixhaven. Because with this cover, the characters are literally just hanging out in a library. They're not intensely studying like the characters on the cover of Candlekeep Mysteries. They're literally just chilling. An owl man is reclining in a chair, a girl is sitting on the table with her foot propped up on what looks like a stack of books, and a young man is waving his hand in the air, conjuring magic. These two are good friends or flirting, but either way, this definitely tells us that if you play in this setting, you're gonna get a very different sort of game. They're also wearing matching clothing, and I do think that tells us that these are, at the very least, apprentices of some sort. I don't know if it's immediately clear that these are students at a school, but that does become clear when you look at the title of the book, Curriculum of Chaos. That does send the signal that this is a school. And when we look at the back cover, we can see a tiny gargoyle holding some scrolls. So he's either another student or he works at the library, and either way, that tells us quite a lot. I know people had mixed feelings about Strixhaven as a product. Some never liked the idea of playing in a low-stakes, dorm room AU D&D world. Others just weren't wild about the execution of this book specifically. Some made it a culture war thing because, of course they did. God forbid a book have art of two men dancing. Sound the alarms. But actually, if we're honest, the most consistent reaction towards this book was the outcry over the introduction of the spell Silvery Barbs, the spell that launched a million identical hot takes. But I don't know, I am still excited to check out this book and take it for a spin at some point, so I am probably going to review it sometime this year or next year. And let's be honest, reviewing Strixhaven is probably the closest I'm ever going to get to making a video about running a Harry Potter-style game in D&D. Now, one of the big questions whenever your group is doing Strixhaven is whether or not everyone is going to play wizards, since it is a wizard school after all. But whether you're all playing different classes, or you're all playing wizards, or bards, or barbarians, or rogues, one thing is the same. It sure would be nice to have some class-specific dice. And you can get dice to represent your class if you sign up for Only Crits' new Kickstarter, which is the sponsor of today's video. I'm a big fan of the dice Only Crits makes. I have been for a few years now, and I've also worked with them a ton, and they're really wonderful to work with. And right now they're running a Kickstarter campaign to create some awesome sets of pastel, sharp-edged, class-specific dice. They launched by offering 3 sets, the Fighter, the Wizard, and the Rogue, but they've already blown through a bunch of their stretch goals and unlocked the sets for the Cleric, the Paladin, the Barbarian, the Ranger, and the Warlock. And as of this recording, they're on track to unlock the Monk next, with the goal to unlock dice sets for all 12 classes. And if we can break through their highest stretch goals, they're going to create custom dice bags and custom dice trays for all 12 classes. Visit the Kickstarter, the link in the description, to get your own set of class dice from Only Crits. And thanks so much to Only Crits for sponsoring this video. This next one is kind of a weird one because Dragonlance was not explicitly a setting book, it was an adventure. But it's also the closest we're going to get to a Dragonlance campaign book anytime soon, so we'll talk about it briefly. This cover is really just a bunch of bad guys. We have the Draconians in the foreground. These are kind of like the Dragonborn, but they're monsters who are just the evil henchmen of the bad guys. In the midground, we have a warrior riding on the back of a dragon, and in the background, there's a spooky image of Lord Soth in the style of Darth Vader from all the old classic Star Wars posters. Quite frankly, I don't know if that's a coincidence, but it definitely accomplishes the same thing. It's meant to demonstrate who the Darth Vader of this campaign setting is, because I think that is kind of true about Lord Soth. From what little I know, he is the Darth Vader of Dragonlance. And further in the background behind him, we can see a whole flight of dragons coming at the camera, so that makes it very clear that we're not just dealing with 1 or 2 dragon riders, but a whole organized army of dragons. This is confirmed when you look at the back cover and see more dragons and another dragon rider. Now, unlike most of these covers, there's actually nothing here that tells you what sort of character you're going to play, which makes sense because, again, this isn't just a campaign setting book, it's also an adventure. But even as a campaign setting book cover, this is still doing a great job of pitching the vibe of Dragonlance, because this cover absolutely tells you what sort of monsters, and more importantly, what sorts of villains you're going to be dealing with in Dragonlance. And again, I don't know if it's a coincidence, but the fact that this cover kind of feels like Star Wars does feel significant, since Dragonlance is often referred to as the Star Wars of D&D. The Draconians are your stormtroopers. Those dragons in the background are, I guess, your TIE fighters. And I already mentioned Lord Soth as our Darth Vader. Whether or not that's a deliberate reference, I do think that the analogy is basically accurate for helping capture the vibe of this setting. And so now that we've established that you don't have to show any adventurers to have a solid campaign setting cover, let's talk about Spelljammer. Let's start with the Astral Adventurer's Guide, because this is the piece that the artist actually mentioned in my comments. Because not only are there no adventurers on this cover, there are no characters at all, just a Mind Flayer ship flying through wild space. But of course, that does kind of tell you a lot, right? First of all, the ship itself has a very distinctive design. Parts of it look like a classic sailing ship, while others more closely resemble giant sea creatures. And speaking of sea creatures, there's a school of fish flying through a nebula beneath the ship. And if we look at the full image, we can see a mutant shark chasing some jellyfish, and an asteroid with a beholder's face on it chasing the Mind Flayer ship. So yeah, vibes. This is pure vibes. It's not really about showing adventurers in action so much as it's demonstrating that wild space is bizarre. It's vaguely nautically themed, but it definitely doesn't just play by the rules of the sea, because you've got some sci-fi style monsters there as well. But there are also 2 other books in the Spelljammer box set. We're not going to talk about Light of Xeraxis because that's an adventure, and adventure covers are a whole other thing. But I do think it's interesting that the monster book is the one with an adventurer on the cover, Minsc from Baldur's Gate. That's because the monsters book is named after an NPC. It's called Boo's Astral Menagerie. But Boo is the miniature giant space hamster companion of Minsc, so you can't just put Boo on the cover. He's a package deal with Minsc. So thus, Minsc is on the cover of the monster book. It seems strange, but once again, these are setting books. There are no rules. If I'm honest, I kind of wish the box set itself had some art of the adventurers. Yes, in the style of the book cover art trap. I wish there had been a piece of art of the kinds of characters you could make with the set. But instead, the box set cover just repurposes the other 3 covers in smaller windows, which I think is kind of a shame, and that's just something I would have liked to see. The next big setting release from Wizards of the Coast is Planescape, and again, it's a box set. So let's look at the book that has the player options, which is called Sigil and the Outlands. And once again, there's no adventurers, just the Lady of Pain. And she is the NPC of Sigil, and she's standing in front of a fantastic rendering of the city itself. So, we're definitely getting an ominous sense of the vibe of Sigil. Then we get Mort's Planar Parade, and there's a bunch of monsters coming out of a bunch of different doorways. The goal of this cover seems to be to capture the weirdness of Sigil. And, mission accomplished. And then we also get Turn of Fortune's Wheel, which is an adventure, so I'm not really going to talk about it, except I am going to say that that is a beautiful cover. I like it a lot. And the last official D&D campaign setting cover I want to talk about today is the one that was produced in partnership with a third party. And that's the cover for the Explorer's Guide to Wildemount. Already we see a very different art design, something that is clearly more hand-drawn art rather than the painted style we typically get. I always thought that was kind of a strange choice. Like, it is a great piece of art by comics artist Carl Kerschel, and it's cool to see someone different get a chance to make a D&D cover who typically wouldn't get the chance to do so. But I was always curious why they went with one that seemed more reminiscent of a comic book or an animated TV series, rather than a painted cover more along the lines of a typical D&D cover. But this question gets a lot easier to answer if we compare it to the other books Critical Role had published at the time. They've been working with Dark Horse for 3 years at this point to publish Vox Machina Origins comic books, and they'd already released 2 Chronicles of Exandria art books, both of which also featured hand-drawn covers rather than painted covers. And of course, just a couple years later, we'd get the Vox Machina animated series. Hand-drawn art is part of Critical Role's house style. So while this cover is definitely a departure from the typical D&D book cover house style, it is in keeping with the style of other Critical Role products, at least at the time. That's the same idea as the covers for the Rick and Morty D&D box set and the D&D crossover comic featuring art in the style of Rick and Morty, because that is the association people have with that franchise. Critical Role might not have the same consistent art style as something like Rick and Morty, but between all their products, I do think that hand-drawn art does make sense with their product line, especially at the time. But okay, now that we've ventured a guess as to why they went with this art style, let's discuss the substance of the piece itself. And I'm actually going to read the way this piece is described on the credits page. Illustrator Carl Kerschel captures the stern visages of 2 sovereigns with a Luxon beacon between them. Bright Queen Laylas Kryn of the Kryn dynasty and King Bertrand Dwendal of the Dwendalian Empire have never seen eye to eye, and their conflict will shape the futures and destinies of all life on the war-torn continent of Wildemount. So we've got the 2 rulers of the major nations of this continent. And by the way, it's a really nice touch that the description says they've never seen eye to eye and the characters aren't making eye contact, but King Bertrand Dwendal is suspiciously side-eyeing the regal drow who stands up imperiously. This actually does help capture the vibe of each of those nations. And the beacon is between them, which also helps nicely line up with the plot point from the campaign. I won't discuss any spoilers here, but it's very appropriate that there's a beacon in between them. Like, it's either getting in the way of collaboration or they're fighting over it. Both are perfectly valid interpretations of this piece of art. So what they've done is they've taken one of the core conflicts of the entire, continent and represented it through this art. But there's one more really clever touch to this piece of art. Because if you're the team behind Critical Role, then anytime you make any product, you have to ask, what is essential to what people like about Critical Role that we can represent as part of this product? When they're writing D&D adventures or supplements, they need to figure out what is going to make this product feel like Critical Role. Now, that answer won't be the same for every audience member. But generally speaking, if you ask the cast of Critical Role, the actual play show where role-playing is so important that the title is a pun, it's the characters themselves. As an example, when they made Call of the Netherdeep, they did their best to make sure their NPCs were fleshed out, because important and well-developed NPCs are a major part of every Critical Role campaign. And here they did the same thing. They focused on 2 extremely important NPCs. And I think it was really smart for them to focus on NPCs rather than putting the Mighty Nine on the book cover. Because the last time they put their characters on the cover of a campaign setting book, it was kind of a mess. This is the story that I wanted to tell back when I made my Player's Handbook cover video, but whenever I make a video about book covers, it always balloons way beyond my expectations. So now, several months later, I finally get to tell you about the forgotten drama behind the Tal'dorei campaign setting book cover. Because I've always thought this was an incredible piece of art. Aaron Riley painted maybe my favorite piece of art of a dragon ever. It features an iconic moment from the campaign where the party first face off against Raishan in the streets of Amon. Although kind of implies that the fight went better than it really did. This looks pretty badass considering that they actually wound up running for their lives. But Grog is right up front with Raishan, which does a great job of capturing the scale, no pun intended, of how big Raishan is. Plus, this is probably the moment right before Grog tries to hit and rolls a 19 and misses. We also see Vorgal destroying Allura's tower in the background, which is a really nice touch, and helps sell the fact that this is not just one dragon attacking, which is what made this such a significant moment. And the entire cast of Vox Machina is present. Except, that's not quite true. Because as some fans noticed, where's Scanlan? Now, when he was asked about this, Matt Mercer said that we're seeing this image from Scanlan's perspective, since he is the storyteller of the group. But that answer wasn't very satisfying. If you're going to put the whole party on the cover, people want to see the whole party. So they wound up releasing 2 different options for stickers you could put on your cover. These depicted Scanlan in the same art style, and you could get your sticker at their next convention, put him on the cover yourself. One of the stickers showed Scanlan with his back to the viewer as he prepared to cast a spell, very much along the lines of the other characters, while the other had him facing the viewer and singing a song. However, I was at that convention. I was at Gen Con in 2017, and I went to the Green Ronin booth, and they were out of Scanlan stickers. And the guy there was clearly annoyed that they didn't have more, and was like, yeah, we weren't in charge of making those. Like, someone had clearly not run something by him, and he was frustrated about explaining it to everyone who walked by. But then today, as I was researching this video, I discovered a Reddit post asking about these covers, and someone who worked on the Critical Role team at the time clarified that they were ordered as a Gen Con exclusive, but the shipping was delayed, so they didn't arrive in Indianapolis in time for the convention at all. So they were just going to send the stickers to the people who gave their email addresses to the booth at Gen Con, something that was clearly not communicated to the guy I talked to 7 years ago who didn't even work for that same company. But anyway, all that to say, that is the problem with a book cover that features a specific party. The audience wants to see them all represented equally. They want to see their favorite characters being badass. And especially with a party of this size, that is a huge challenge for a cover artist. But then several years later, we got Tal'dorei Reborn, a brand new version of the book now published by Critical Role's publishing imprint, Darrington Press, and with lessons learned from publishing lots of other products. And this edition has a brand new cover. This time, a party of adventurers fights a griffin made of starlight on the deck of a skyship, which is also in flames and listing to one side. I always thought that was a very strange choice. Don't get me wrong, this is an incredible cover by Janelle Jumalan. I think the purple is so striking, and the constellations and the wings are a really nice touch. And let's be fair, if your book is going to include a new monster as cool as the Cosmic Griffin, which is, I believe, called an Adranok, then yeah, put that dude right on the cover, 100%. But I thought it was kind of strange considering we hadn't seen this creature appear in any Critical Role media by this point. Sure, now that we've seen EXU Calamity, there's a Cosmic Griffin that bears a heavy resemblance to the Adranok, but at the time, this was something completely new. But wasn't the point of a Critical Role campaign setting cover to show you something familiar to people who had seen the campaign? Well, not necessarily. As much fun as it was for me to see a scene from the campaign depicted in an incredible piece of art, you can also make the case that it would be better to include a new piece of art that tells fans, old and new alike, there's going to be something they've never seen before in this book. In this case, we get no familiar NPCs or familiar monsters. We get something unexpected, something that I'm pretty sure didn't even appear as a monster in the original Tal'dorei guide. And that serves as a signal that there's going to be a lot of new, cool stuff in this book. But obviously, you still want to communicate what this setting is like to the audience, so let's show them something that is familiar, something that we do recognize from Tal'dorei. These are new NPCs, and this is a new monster, but the environment itself is familiar to fans of the Vox Machina campaign. They're on the deck of a skyship. This also does a great job of telling a new audience member that Tal'dorei is a very high magic setting. After all, not only are they fighting a griffin made of constellations, but they're doing so on what is unmistakably the deck of a flying sailing ship. Well, minus the sails, but you know what I mean. It's not a spaceship or anything futuristic. It looks like a sailing ship, but without sails or rigging, because instead it could just fly on its own. It's even got wings on the side that look like the sails of a ship, although this one is kind of burnt up, so that ship is clearly in pretty bad shape. However, there is one more detail that makes this feel like Critical Role, and it comes in the form of the NPCs. Or to be more accurate, in the number of NPCs. Because this cover depicts a party of 6. And that is so funny to me. They didn't have to include the same number of heroes in this cover as they did in the original Tal'dorei guide, but they did it anyway, and I just have to respect that. They put the heroes' backs to us again, but this time they can be a lot smaller in the frame because they're not famous characters like the cast of Vox Machina. However, I think it is hilarious that they said, you know what'll make this feel like Critical Role? Having way too many characters in the party. Like, I mean, yeah, they nailed it. That's true, but that's just so funny that that is the detail they chose to represent on this cover to make it feel like Critical Role. Although, if I'm honest, I could just imagine this being a practical decision to help sell the story. This Adranok is at least CR 12, and so if this party's going to have any chance against it, they're going to need to have the action economy on their side. So I honestly wonder if they aren't also telling their audience, hey, have you ever struggled to run a fight where it's a whole party of characters versus one monster? Don't worry. We here at Critical Role have a lot of experience trying to solve that very same problem. Check out this book, and you'll get your hands on some nasty baddies that can actually challenge your party of 5. Now, I might be completely off the mark about all those guesses about why these artists chose to represent these settings with these specific choices, but that is the fun part about interpreting art. We can all come in with our own guesses about what was going through the artists' heads and what messages the designers and the publishers were hoping the art would convey to a brand new audience. And all these readings are valid, and none of them are wrong. Unless, of course, if any of these artists do want to come and leave a comment and let me know if I was right or wrong about what decisions were made and why they made the choices they did with these art pieces, then I guess we'll know whether I was wrong. Like, that'd be fair enough at this point. Thanks so much for watching. I was also originally going to discuss the covers for Midgard and Grimhollow, but I'm not as familiar with those settings, so I'm going to be way more off the mark with those. And well, yes, the fun of this exercise is kind of seeing how the designers communicate things about the setting to a brand new audience who knows nothing about them. It's a lot easier to analyze how well they did with that if you're at least a little more familiar with the setting yourself. I feel comfortable discussing the official Wizards of the Coast settings because I've been much more plugged into the ecosystem, and I picked up a lot more of the details about Eberron and Strixhaven. Plus, every time I do one of these videos about a D&D book cover, they wind up being so much longer than I ever expected, so I just had to cut a couple of them. Thankfully, I think this is the last video in this series. I've talked about all the different types of D&D book covers. Unless, of course, I make one about the covers for the 5th edition adventures. I don't know. Let me know if you want me to make a video about the 5e adventurer covers, but that would be way down the road because I really would want to read through all those adventures before making that video. That would be way, way down the line. These videos are also really hit and miss with the algorithm, so it doesn't really incentivize me to make them that often. Aha! Oh, shit.
So you do think about the algorithm. That's interesting because in your last video, I remember a certain YouTuber telling a certain algorithm wizard that he didn't care about the algorithm.
Yes, I did.
Seems like somebody owes somebody else an apology.
I apologized to you in that video. I told you that I didn't mean to upset you.
But you didn't admit you think about the algorithm.
Okay, yes, I see your point. I sometimes hold off on making certain kinds of videos that I think are going to perform poorly in the algorithm. So yes, I said it. I don't think about the algorithm. I don't care about the algorithm. That is not, strictly speaking, true. I do sometimes keep it in mind.
Thank you. Now make a Harry Potter video.
No.
Please.
No. Ah! Get out of here. We're done. Thanks so much for watching. I'll be back with another video very soon. Make sure to like and subscribe and ring the bell so that you can keep up with bonus videos like this one. If you want to see this video with no ads, and in fact pretty much all my videos with no ads, then check out my Patreon or become a YouTube member for those versions of these videos, as well as other cool perks. You can also join my Discord server and my newsletter. Those links are in the doobly-doo below. Click here for a video that I put out all about the art that inspires me when I run my games. I'm really happy with how that video came out. Until next time, play fair and have fun.